They burned the last Grand Master at the stake. They buried their secrets, and for 700 years we've been trying to understand why. Paris, 1314. The flames are rising. The Seine flickers with their reflection. And in the center of the pyre stands a man, silent, bound, and waiting to die. His name is Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. He doesn't scream. He doesn't plead. He looks at the crowd of nobles and priests and whispers his final curse. A prophecy that, within a year, both the king and the pope would follow him into death. What secret did he take with him into the fire? This is not just the story of a religious order. This is the story of how 9 warrior monks, poor, anonymous, and forgotten, rose to control castles, command armies, finance kings, and answer to no one but the Pope. They wore white mantles. They lived by prayer. And they became so powerful they had to be destroyed. How does a sworn brotherhood of soldier priests become so feared? It had to be erased from history. This isn't about treasure. It's about power, faith, betrayal, and the cost of loyalty to something higher than kings. So ask yourself this: what if everything you thought you knew about the Templars was only the cover story? To those of you returning, thank you. You've walked into the shadows with us before. You know the weight of truth that history hides beneath the surface. And if you've made it back for this story, you already understand. Some things aren't forgotten. They're buried on purpose. For the rest of you watching but still not subscribed, why not? What exactly are you waiting for the next Grand Master to burn? If you're refusing to subscribe, at least have the courage to tell us why in the comments. We read every word, and we remember. And a cry for salvation. Not a metaphor, not a slogan, a real cry, from real men, from barefoot pilgrims lying face down in the dust, bleeding beside the bones of the ones who didn't make it. The world into which the Knights Templar would eventually emerge was not noble, not romantic. It was starving. Europe at the end of the 11th century was a landscape ruled not by kings, but by fear. Fear of damnation. Fear of famine. Fear of one's soul being lost forever in a world that felt like it was falling apart. Famine struck entire regions without warning. Villages were erased overnight. Crops failed. Livestock died. But even worse than hunger was spiritual terror. The church was the only light in a world full of superstition and cruelty. And that light was flickering. The peasants worked. The lords fought. The priests ruled. And the only way to cleanse your soul was through pilgrimage. So they walked across kingdoms, forests, deserts, to Jerusalem, the holiest place on earth. But the roads to Jerusalem were soaked in blood. Bandits waited in mountain passes. Warlords extorted border taxes. Armed guards demanded bribes, and if you couldn't pay, they beat you or took what they wanted. Women were assaulted. Men were left with broken legs. And still they kept walking, because if they didn't, they believed their souls would burn. The Holy Land by then was controlled by the Fatimid Caliphate, and though Christian pilgrims were often allowed to visit, conditions fluctuated. Then came the Seljuk Turks, war-hardened, newly converted, politically ruthless. They didn't just threaten pilgrims. They defeated the Byzantine Empire itself at Manzikert in 1071. The road to Jerusalem had become a road into hell. And then something unthinkable happened. A letter crossed the Mediterranean. A cry for help, not from a peasant but from an emperor. Alexios I Komnenos, ruler of the Byzantine Empire, humiliated at Manzikert, sent word to the Pope. Send me knights. I am losing the East. In November 1095, in a field outside the town of Clermont, Pope Urban II stood on a platform and spoke to the crowd. He did not offer charity. He offered eternity. He told them the tomb of Christ was in danger, that their Christian brothers were crying out. and that God, not him, willed it. Take up the cross, and if you die in battle, your sins will be forgiven. This was not just religion, it was strategy. Urban was trying to unify a fractured church, reassert papal supremacy, and redirect the violence of Europe's knights outward. He gave them a war that would feel like worship. And the crowd roared. They sewed red crosses onto their shoulders. They sold their land. They said goodbye to their wives. And they marched toward a land they'd never seen, to fight an enemy they didn't understand, for a kingdom they believed was God's. The First Crusade wasn't a single army. It was a chaotic flood. Some were knights. Others were peasants. And the first to go, the so-called People's Crusade, were annihilated by the Turks before even reaching Jerusalem. But the real Crusader force arrived in waves. And by 1099, they reached the walls of Jerusalem. It was a city they'd never lived in. A land they didn't speak the language of. They were tired, starving, raging with fever, heat, and vengeance. They breached the walls. And what followed was not holy. It was slaughter. Men were killed in their homes. Children died in the streets. Even the mosques were not spared. One chronicler wrote that the streets ran ankle-deep in blood. Another said that the Crusaders rode through corpses on horseback without stopping. And then, silence. They took the city. But what they created wasn't peace. It was a kingdom surrounded by enemies, understaffed, underdefended, and under siege from the moment it was born. This was the world the Templars inherited. Not the glory of conquest, but the failure of salvation. Because if taking Jerusalem was victory, why was everything still falling apart? The pilgrims still came. The roads were still dangerous. And the Christians who stayed behind to rule the holy city were desperate for protection. They claimed it for God. But their hands were red. And the violence didn't end, it only opened the gate for something new. Something more disciplined, more devoted, and far more dangerous. The stage was set. And 9 knights were about to ride out of obscurity and into legend. The conquest of Jerusalem in 1099 had been celebrated in Europe as divine victory. But behind the hymnals and heraldry, a darker truth took shape. The holy city was won, but it wasn't safe. It was surrounded by enemies, plagued by infighting among the Crusader elite, and defensively brittle. The Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, as it came to be known, had the skeleton of a state, a crowned ruler, a court, a cathedral, but it had no real foundation. Roads from the port of Jaffa to the city were filled with danger. Bandits lurked in valleys. Raiders knew exactly where to ambush unarmed pilgrims traveling to the holy sites. The new kingdom lacked one thing its founders promised: protection. And in that void, that space between promise and peril, something unthinkable began to form. A different kind of brotherhood. 9 knights. No wealth. No banners. And yet they walked into the palace of the King of Jerusalem with a plan to change the world. The year is 1119 AD. The king is Baldwin II, ruler of Jerusalem, a hardened, strategic monarch with thinning options and rising pressure from both the Muslim powers outside the walls and the divided Crusader nobility inside them. Into his court walked 9 men, led by a French nobleman of minor status. Hugues de Payens. He didn't come as a prince. He didn't carry the authority of a bishop or the wealth of a baron. He came with an idea. He and his fellow knights, all veterans of the Crusades, all landless, all deeply pious, offered something no one had seen before: a monastic order of warrior monks. These men would take the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience like monks, but they would fight, not for wealth, not for conquest, but to protect pilgrims traveling the Holy Land. They weren't asking for land. They weren't asking for gold. They wanted only one thing: to serve. But in that humble request was something radical. because they were proposing a fusion the church had long resisted: the sword with the cross. And Baldwin, recognizing the desperation of the moment, gave them what little he could. He gave them quarters on the Temple Mount. It was a curious decision. The Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif to Muslims, had long been a site of myth, politics, and deep religious symbolism. To Jews, it was the location of Solomon's Temple, the holiest site in ancient Israel, destroyed and rebuilt across centuries. To Christians, it was the scene of Jesus' teachings and prophecies. To Muslims, it was the place where the Prophet Muhammad was believed to have ascended into heaven during his night journey, the site now home to the Dome of the Rock in Al-Aqsa Mosque. But to these 9 knights, it became something else entirely: headquarters. Their official name: the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. A mouthful, eventually shortened by the people to just Templars. They slept in what was believed to be the stables of Solomon, directly underneath the platform that once held the ancient temple itself. And here, in the dark, stone corridors beneath Jerusalem, the whispers began. To understand the mystery of the early Templars, you must accept one fact. For the first 9 years of their existence, no one joined them. No recruitment. No public campaign. No new members. Just the same 9 men. What were they doing? On the surface, they were guarding pilgrims. But records are thin, and most of what we know comes later, from chroniclers, papal letters, and legends. And then, there are the archaeological anomalies. Modern excavations on the Temple Mount have revealed tunnel-like cavities, possibly dating from the 12th century, directly beneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where the Templars were housed. Some historians argue these were storage areas or defensive structures. Others aren't so sure. One persistent theory, popular but speculative, holds that the original Templars may have been digging beneath the temple, searching for relics, for scrolls, artifacts, or even the Ark of the Covenant. There's no definitive proof. But what is undeniable is this: something changed. By 1129, 9 years after their quiet beginning, the Templars emerged from obscurity. At the Council of Troyes, backed by Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most powerful churchmen of his time, the Templars were officially recognized by the Catholic Church. They were granted a rule, modeled on the Benedictine Code but adapted for warriors. And they were given papal support, total independence from local bishops and kings. They answered only to the Pope. And suddenly, the poor knights were poor no longer. Donations poured in from France, England, Spain, and beyond. Lands were given. Fortresses offered. Gold entrusted. But the men themselves, the 9 who started it, disappeared into the myth. They left no memoirs. No letters. Only one blurry document written decades later, naming their names and marking their year of foundation. And yet, they were few. They were poor. And they were forgotten by most. But soon, their cross would cast a shadow across continents. The Templars were no longer just guardians of pilgrims. They were becoming something unprecedented. A transnational, militarized religious institution. A state without borders. An army without a king. And a power that no one could control for long. They took vows of silence. But on the battlefield, their silence was terrifying. No hymns. No war cries. Only the steady rhythm of hooves pounding the earth and the glint of steel under a sun that showed no mercy. Outside the village of Hattin, in the July heat of 1187, the Templar banners had fallen. Red crosses trampled in dust. Ash blowing across the Galilean plain. Smoke rising from scattered Christian tents. And in the center of this smoldering ruin, the reality could no longer be denied. Christendom had lost. And with it, Jerusalem would fall. But how did the very men sworn to defend the holy city, those famed for their unshakable courage and ritual discipline, come to die here in silence, surrounded and undone. To answer that, we must go back, not to their fall but to their rise as the fiercest warriors of the medieval world. From the outside the Templars looked like monks in armor. But to those who fought beside them, or against them, they were something else entirely. According to their rule, retreat was not an option. Even when outnumbered, even when their death was certain. Their code was designed to break the normal instincts of battle. Fear was irrelevant. Death was expected. Victory was secondary to obedience. Before battle, they took Holy Communion, confessed their sins and prepared to die. Not in fear but in ritual silence. They were ordered not to speak unless necessary. Not to boast. Not to question their command. And when the moment came, to charge as one body. Formations were tight. Templar knights rode in ranks of 4 or 10, their squires behind them, often supported by sergeants, lower-class fighters in black surcoats. Each knight wore a white mantle with a red cross, not as decoration but as a symbol of martyrdom. They believed in the concept of a glorious death, and their rules stated clearly, if one knight broke the line and charged recklessly, the others must not follow, unless the enemy numbered fewer than 3. Their discipline was mathematical. This wasn't just warfare. It was a ritual of sacrifice wrapped in steel and scripture. But if the Templars were forged in holy war, their ultimate adversary would be too. Al-ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin, was no ordinary opponent. Born in Tikrit, educated in Damascus and shaped by military campaigns in Egypt, Saladin was not merely a military leader. He was a unifier. He brought together a fractured Muslim world. Kurds, Turks, Arabs. Under his banner they became a single determined force. His personal devotion to Islam was matched only by his strategic brilliance and calm temperament. And Saladin did not underestimate the Templars. He is said to have respected their courage but feared their ferocity. In multiple encounters he learned quickly, the Templars would not break. In 1177 at the Battle of Montgessard, a much smaller Crusader force, including Templars, crushed a Muslim army 3 times their size. Saladin barely escaped with his life. He never forgot that humiliation. So when he returned 10 years later at the head of an overwhelming army, he came prepared. July 4, 1187. The Battle of Hattin is not just a defeat, it is a collapse. Saladin lured the Christian army out of fortified positions and into open terrain, where heat and thirst became weapons. The wells were blocked. The winds carried smoke from burning brush into the faces of the Crusaders. And still the Templars held formation. But this time faith was not enough. Accounts describe the Templars as the last to fall. Many were captured. Some, including the master of the order, were executed on Saladin's command. It said that Saladin personally spared no Templar knight who refused to convert. Their beheadings were carried out in view of other prisoners, a brutal demonstration of power. And soon after, Jerusalem surrendered. The city the Templars had vowed to protect, their spiritual reason for existing, was lost. But the order did not collapse. They regrouped, rebuilt, and learned. Because the battlefield was no longer just in Jerusalem. Their mission, and their legend, would now expand across continents. From the Iberian Peninsula to the plains of Hungary, from the coasts of Syria to the Scottish Highlands, the Templars evolved into a global military elite. They participated in the Third Crusade, fighting beside Richard the Lionheart, who entrusted them with guarding prisoners, negotiating truces, and even planning battlefield logistics. They built castles with walls 12 feet thick, in places like Tortosa, Safed, and the towering fortress of Croc de Chevaliers. They helped develop early siege warfare tactics, incorporating Greek fire, stone-throwing mangonels, and layered defensive bastions. But their greatest power wasn't just the sword. It was how they made war holy. They were not mercenaries. They didn't fight for land. They fought for God's justice. Or so they believed. And this belief made them dangerous to everyone, even to the kings they claimed to serve. They were made to protect. But by now they had become the sword arm of something far greater than they ever intended. Not a country, not a crown, but an idea. One that could outlive any battle and haunt any throne. The Templars were supposed to serve the king. But what happens when the king must beg the knight? They were founded in humility, bound by vows of poverty, sworn to obedience. But by the mid-12th century, the Knights Templar were no longer monks with swords. They were landowners, strategists, and, most dangerously of all, independent. And in the gilded halls of Crusader courts, kings began to realize something troubling. The most powerful order in Christendom did not answer to them. To understand the transformation, we must return to Jerusalem, not the sacred city of pilgrims, but the bureaucratic nucleus of the Latin East. There, behind the marble altars and cathedral spires, real power was negotiated in whispers, in patronage, and in military leverage. At the center of this web sat the Templars, not as guests but as kingmakers. They controlled dozens of fortresses across the Levant: Bagres, Gaston, La Roche-Guillaume, and the formidable Safed. Each one was more than a stronghold. It was a nerve center with treasuries, grain stores, blacksmiths, scribes, and supply lines. And each was manned by warriors who took no orders from a monarch, a noble, or even a local patriarch. Only the Pope could command them. So when kings like Baldwin II of Jerusalem came to power, they didn't merely consult the Templars. They depended on them. Baldwin granted them their first headquarters on the Temple Mount. He gave them privileges and lands, not just out of generosity but because he needed what they offered. An elite force that could fight, build, plan, and most importantly act without local entanglements. Later kings followed suit. Fulk of Anjou, king by marriage and crusader by instinct, leaned heavily on Templar logistics to control his military borders. And Raymond III of Tripoli, a political survivor in a divided kingdom, entrusted the Templars with his diplomacy, finances, and military campaigns. These kings were powerful. But in many cases the Templars held the keys to castles, to treasury vaults, and even to access routes through dangerous terrain. This wasn't cooperation. It was reliance. And reliance breeds resentment. Unlike secular lords, the Templars paid no taxes. They owed no military service to kings. They could move arms and money across borders freely, thanks to papal exemptions. In France, England, Spain, they had estates, mills, markets, farms, and manor houses. And their lands were often richer than the baronies that surrounded them. Yet they answered only to Rome. This meant they could act autonomously, making treaties, moving troops, buying land, and collecting rent without permission from the local crown. It was a quiet revolution in how power worked in the Middle Ages. And that independence didn't just offend kings. It threatened them. Because while the Templars were not a kingdom, they operated like one. A kingdom within kingdoms, borderless, mobile, and backed by the one power no monarch dared defy: the Holy See. Their rising authority also brought new enemies, not just Muslims but other Christian orders. Most notably, the Knights Hospitaller. Originally a charitable group caring for sick and poor pilgrims, the Hospitallers had also evolved into a militarized order, and they were not pleased to live in the shadow of Templar fame. The two orders often worked together on the battlefield. But in private their rivalry was vicious. They argued over territory, donations, credit with kings, and access to the Pope. Diplomatic letters between the two show thinly veiled hostility. and in Tortosa, Antioch, and Acre, there were recorded incidents of open conflict between Templar and Hospitaller garrisons. Even in the heat of crusading campaigns, they sometimes refused to cooperate, prioritizing their own authority over the shared Christian cause. This wasn't just personal pride. It was institutional warfare, two massive, militarized orders competing for control of a fragile and volatile region. And it raised an uncomfortable question in royal courts. They do not serve us, who do they serve? The Church gave the Templars legal immunity. This meant secular courts could not prosecute them. And because they were celibate, propertyless monks, they couldn't be blackmailed, married off, or bought like other lords. In an era where power was negotiated through feudal obligations, marriages, and land exchanges, the Templars were immune to all three. They became trustees, bankers, and guardians of secrets. They held royal treasuries, including those of Henry II of England, James I of Aragon, and Charles of Anjou. They lent money to kings, secured ransoms for prisoners, and even arranged escrow-style transactions centuries before the term existed. And yet, they were not accountable to those they served. One chronicler of the period described them as a church within a church and a court above courts. Every coin deposited in a Templar stronghold was one less in a royal coffer. Every castle they fortified was another fortress not answerable to the king. And every battlefield victory or failure reminded monarchs of the uncomfortable truth. They were borrowing power from an institution they could not control. In public, kings praised the Templars. In private, they feared them, because they had created something uncontainable. They had become more than protectors of pilgrims. They were becoming a kingdom within kingdoms. And no one likes to share power. And in the shadows of Europe's cathedrals and castles, murmurs began to spread. Murmurs of arrogance, of corruption, of secrets kept in stone vaults. And soon one king would rise, not just to question the Templars, but to destroy them. They were knights with no pockets. And yet they became Europe's most powerful bankers. Picture this. A rain-soaked morning on the English coast. A pilgrim, shoes worn through, eyes weary with fear, steps into the stone hall of a Templar preceptory. He carries no sword, no companion, and too much gold. Not enough to make him rich, just enough to make him a target. He has heard stories of pilgrims robbed in the Pyrenees, slain in Sicily, or left to die on the salt roads of Anatolia. And so, reluctantly, he hands over his life savings, not to a local banker but to a Templar brother, clad in white and red, who says almost nothing as he writes something down on parchment. Thousands of miles away in the port of Acre, weeks later, that same pilgrim walks into another fortress. The guards let him pass. He presents the parchment. And he receives his gold back, minus a small handling fee, in local coin. It's the first known form of a check, and it has just bought him safety, legitimacy, and anonymity. The Templars had done more than protect his journey. They had created the first international banking network in Europe. In the 12th century, commerce was a minefield. There were no credit cards, no centralized currency, and worse, no peace. A traveler carrying silver across provinces had to worry about bandits, local tolls, and currency conversion at every border. What the Templars offered was something unheard of. Cross-border financial stability backed by religious authority and military might. A pilgrim could deposit funds in London, receive a coded document, written in an internal system only the Templars understood, and retrieve the money in Jerusalem, Acre, or even Antioch. They had established trust in a world full of thieves. Their global network of preceptories and commanderies acted like regional bank branches. And their records were obsessively maintained, with encrypted accounting systems, cross-checked in different regions, likely years ahead of secular administrations. It wasn't just faith. It was infrastructure. And it worked. What began with pilgrims quickly escalated. By the late 12th century, monarchs, nobles, and even popes began to use the Templars not as warriors, but as treasurers. When King John of England needed to secure his debts during the chaos of his reign, he placed the crown jewels in Templar custody. His son, Henry III, made a regular habit of storing royal funds with them, not in London's royal treasury but at the new temple on the Thames. Across the Channel, James I of Aragon used Templar facilities to secure not just money, but strategic documents, including charters and royal decrees. And Philip Augustus of France, ironically, was both a patron and later an accuser of the order, keeping his reserves under their control while plotting their eventual downfall. Why? Because the Templars weren't just secure. They were politically neutral, answerable to the Pope, yes, but not entangled in local disputes. Their fortresses were seen as safe havens, and their military discipline ensured discretion. This made them ideal custodians of secrets, marriage contracts, territorial claims, even papal orders meant for selective eyes. And over time, this gave them something far more dangerous than money: leverage. It's easy to imagine the Templars growing rich, their halls piled with treasure. But in truth, no individual knight owned anything. Their rules forbade personal wealth, private letters, even individual horses beyond the regulated too. But the order as an institution? That was another story. They owned thousands of acres of farmland across Europe, some of it gifted, some of it purchased. Their monasteries had windmills, tanneries, blacksmiths, and markets. They leased land, operated ships, ran ports, and offered storage to merchants. And yet they maintained a public image of poverty, quoting Christ's warning about the dangers of riches. Their simple robes and austere diet masked the reality. The Templars were now one of the most powerful financial entities in the medieval world. Behind the white mantles were ledgers. Behind the swords, seals and codes. And behind their fortresses, vaults. At first it was awe, then envy, and finally suspicion. People began to ask, if the Templars claimed no wealth, how were they building multinational networks of castles, ships, and cities? If they obeyed only God, why were kings and popes increasingly indebted to them? Local nobles, especially those whose lands bordered Templar estates, grew resentful. How could monks, answerable to no secular law, operate more efficiently than royal bureaucrats? The whispers turned darker. Were they hiding gold? Hoarding documents? Scheming with foreigners? And then came the more dangerous accusations. That the Templars had drifted from their original mission, that they had grown corrupt, that they served no one but themselves. It wasn't just jealousy. It was fear, the kind of fear that festers in the cracks between faith and finance. They claimed no wealth of their own. But now even kings owed them. The Templars had built a fortress of trust. But trust, like stone, can crumble under the right pressure. And one man more ambitious than most, and more in debt than all, would soon test just how much gold the Templars truly held, and what secrets they had buried alongside it. If you've made it this far, thank you. Seriously. You're not just watching a video, you're walking through the shadows of history with us, piece by piece. And if you've found yourself gripped, questioning what's real and what was buried, then this is exactly the story we want to tell, together. So if you haven't already, subscribe now. It helps us uncover more truths that deserve the light. And if you've decided not to subscribe, we respect that. But we're curious, what's holding you back? Drop it in the comments. Let's talk about it. You've already come this far, your voice matters here. What do you become when your every word, every meal, every dream, belongs to the order? Before the swords are raised, before the hooves strike stone, before the name Templar becomes fearsome, there is silence. Not symbolic silence. Not poetic silence. Real silence, imposed, measured, sacred. Step into the Templar chapel at dawn. It's still dark outside. The stone is cold. The only light flickers from a single candle at the altar. There is no music. Only voices, ancient Latin chants repeated daily, hour after hour. The brothers kneel not in robes but in armor. Male links catch the light like chain lightning. Their eyes are lowered not out of reverence, but out of discipline. They don't speak, not even to each other, because silence is not absence. Silence is obedience. The rule of the Templars was drafted by Bernard of Clairvaux and codified in 1129 at the Council of Troyes. It wasn't just a monastic charter. It was a blueprint for extinguishing the self. No private letters. No family ties. No ownership of weapons or horses beyond what the order allotted. Their very names faded, replaced by rank and function. At meals they were forbidden to speak. If a brother needed something he used hand signs, not words. Meat was permitted no more than 3 times a week, and sometimes not at all during penitential seasons. Their diet was austere. Legumes, bread, watered wine with fish when available. They slept fully clothed, often with a weapon nearby on straw mats, ready to respond to alarm bells at any hour. If they laughed too much or broke silence, they faced penalties. If they disobeyed orders, they could be publicly humiliated, made to eat on the ground without a table, like dogs. Severe cases were cast out, stripped of the mantle, and left nameless again. Justice within the Templar order wasn't handed down by nobles or bishops. It came from within, from an internal court made up of brothers. Every accusation was weighed carefully. But if guilt was found, the response was swift and unrelenting. Some punishments were symbolic, like the loss of riding privileges or eating last at meals. Others were brutal: imprisonment, flagellation, or perpetual penance. What made it worse wasn't the cruelty, it was the consent. Every Templar swore to obey without question. If the master of the order told you to ride into death, you rode. If he ordered you to fast for days, you fasted. And when doubt crept in, it stayed silent, because to question the order was to risk your soul. Most Templar writings were destroyed, either by fire, war, or deliberate suppression. But a few letters slipped through. In one, Brother Odo of Burgundy writes to his cousin, carefully worded as the rule forbade personal letters. He doesn't speak of glory or conquest. He speaks of isolation, of watching the sea from the walls of Acre, wondering what life might have looked like had he never taken the vow. In another fragment, a Templar based in La Rochelle pleads with his prior for leniency, not for himself, but for a younger brother who had grown thin with dread and broke the fast. The request was denied. These letters are rare, but they open a window few dared to glance through. That under the white mantle, some men broke quietly. They didn't renounce their faith, but they began to feel trapped by it. The Templars viewed spiritual discipline as a weapon sharper than any sword. Every ritual, from confession to communion, was part of a warfare of the soul. They believed they were fighting the devil in every action, through restraint, not indulgence. They fasted not to suffer, but to purge weakness. They denied themselves comfort because comfort breeds doubt. Women were not to be touched, not even family. Not a mother's kiss. Not a sister's hug. And if a brother dreamt of a woman, even in sleep, he was expected to confess it at chapter. If he failed to and was discovered, it was grounds for expulsion. What does that do to a man? To spend decades never hearing your name whispered in affection, never being embraced, never being forgiven outside the walls of your faith? You forget who you were. You become only what the order wants you to be. They called it a holy life. But holiness came at the price of the self. The Templars weren't just warriors. They were machines of ritual, skeletons of devotion, encased in armor and stripped of the ordinary pleasures that define human life. But the world outside their gates was beginning to shift. New enemies were rising. Old alliances were fracturing. And the men who had given up everything were about to find that everything they built might be turned against them. They were knights, not sailors. Or so we thought. But when land was no longer safe, it was the sea that kept their mission alive. The story of the Knights Templar is usually told in dust, swords clashing in deserts, hooves pounding crusader roads, stone fortresses rising from the Levant. But beneath the surface of this martial legacy lies a quieter, darker story, a story written not in blood but in salt water. Because when the order could no longer defend Jerusalem, when castles were lost and alliances crumbled, the Templars turned to the sea. And that changed everything. Who controlled the sea controlled the survival of Christendom. At first glance, the Templars seemed like an army of the land, but they were quietly becoming guardians of the last ports. Acre, in present-day Israel, became their eastern anchor. After the loss of Jerusalem in 1187, the Templars made Acre their new headquarters. They didn't just build barracks. They built docks, arsenals, and a command center that functioned like a military port authority. Jaffa, further down the coast, was smaller but strategic. It became a transit point for pilgrims and reinforcements. Every voyage that ended there, from Italy, Marseille, or Cyprus, touched Templar hands. But the most mysterious of all was La Rochelle on France's Atlantic coast. While most eyes were on the Holy Land, the Templars were digging deep harbors, constructing fortified towers, and establishing themselves in a place that seemed far from the Crusades. Why La Rochelle? Because it was perfect for escape, and possibly for something else entirely. The Templars did not invent naval logistics, but they professionalized it. Their war galleys weren't sleek Venetian masterpieces. They were functional, oared, wide-bellied, designed to transport pilgrims, soldiers, and cargo across hostile waters. Each ship was armed, crewed by Templar mariners sworn to the rule, and escorted in convoys that mirrored their discipline on land. Their sea voyages weren't pilgrimages. They were operations. Ships carried horses and slings to keep them upright. Cargo was labeled with Templar seals. Routes were timed to avoid seasonal storms and pirate hotspots. They also carried sensitive documents, sealed scrolls, and sometimes prisoners, moved covertly between territories. These were not merchants at sea. They were a maritime brotherhood tasked with keeping Christendom connected across oceans. Their network was so tight that a knight could sail from southern England to Acre, and never leave Templar protection. As Templar maritime power grew, so did their responsibility. Piracy, both Islamic corsairs and Christian raiders, was an ever-present threat. The Templars developed naval escorts that operated like convoy guards, armed with ballistae and crossbows to repel boarding parties. In coastal zones, they began to build castles facing the sea, not just inland fortresses. The castle at Tortosa, for example, featured port-accessible granaries and a walled enclosure for unloading cargo during sieges. On Cyprus, after Richard the Lionheart's conquest, the Templars briefly held the entire island, not for glory but for naval logistics. Templar engineers built coastal towers equipped with signal fires to warn of incoming fleets. These were not reactive measures. They were preemptive strategies born from centuries of adapting war to the tides. The Templars' naval expertise reached its apex during the Siege of Acre, 1291, the final stand of the Latin Kingdom in the Holy Land. By this time, Acre was a fortress under siege by the Mamluks, and the sea was its only lifeline. Templar ships brought in last-minute reinforcements from Cyprus, desperately breaking through naval blockades to deliver food, weapons, and hope. Eyewitnesses wrote of knights vomiting from the stench of rotting bodies as they unloaded cargo, only to grab swords and charge into the breach. The order's final commander in the city, Peter of Sèvres, refused to abandon his post. When the walls were finally breached, he ordered the last Templars to fall back into the sea gate, and to die fighting. The sea had once been their salvation. At Acre it became their tomb. After the fall of Acre, the Templars didn't vanish. They recalibrated. In Portugal, a new order emerged, the Order of Christ, founded by King Dinis as a Templar successor. This wasn't just political repackaging. It was a preservation of maritime genius. The knowledge the Templars had gathered, navigation, shipbuilding, supply routes, convoy management, became the foundation for the Portuguese age of exploration. Henry the Navigator, credited with ushering in Europe's sea empires, was Grand Master of the Order of Christ. The Order's emblem, a red cross, would fly again, not on land but on the sails of caravels bound for Africa and India. Templar legacy didn't drown at Acre. It set sail again under new names in new waters. And now, the question that won't die. In the days before their mass arrest in 1307, Templar ships allegedly vanished from La Rochelle. No wrecks were found. No cargo was seized. No records show where they went. Did they sail to Portugal? To Scotland? To the Baltic? Or did they vanish into legend? Some say they carried treasure. Others say they carried secrets. But the only truth we know is this. The Templars knew how to disappear. And the sea was always waiting. It was a morning like any other, until the king moved against his knights and history caught fire. The date was October 13, 1307, a Friday. In Paris they knocked at dawn. Across France, knights were dragged from their beds, disarmed, shackled, disrobed. Some resisted. Most were caught off guard. In less than 24 hours, an entire order, centuries old, ceased to exist in the eyes of the crown. What? Heresy? Blasphemy? Or was that just the cover story? To understand the fall of the Templars, you must first understand Philip IV of France, known by some as Philip the Fair, though not for his sense of justice. He was handsome, calculating, and dangerously in debt. By the early 1300s, Philip had waged costly wars against England and Flanders, and his coffers were empty. He had taxed the clergy, debased coinage, and even expelled the Jews from France in 1306, seizing their assets in the process. But there was one institution left that stood independent of his reach, the Knights Templar. They weren't just warriors. They were bankers. And Philip owed them more than coin. He owed them favor, power, and humiliation. When he sought refuge during riots in Paris, the Templars gave him shelter. He never forgot that, and he never forgave it. Then came the moment that would give Friday the 13th its cursed reputation for centuries. Philip planned it with chilling precision. At dawn on October 13, 1307, his agents launched a nationwide arrest of every Templar in France. The charges were ready before the doors were broken. Heresy, sodomy, worship of idols, spitting on the cross. A list designed not just to accuse, but to annihilate. The public was stunned. No warning. No precedent. The same knights who had defended Christendom for 200 years were suddenly branded enemies of the Church. But what many didn't know, and what some still deny, is that Philip's men had forged most of the accusations, based on testimonies extracted under torture, in prisons already rigged for compliance. And the Pope? He hadn't even been told, not yet. Once arrested, the knights were thrown into cold stone cells, denied clergy access, and left to rot unless they confessed. Inquisition records from Chinon, Tours, and Paris reveal scenes of forced confessions, with hot irons, thumb screws, starvation, and beatings used until men broke. Geoffroy de Gonneville, a Templar commander, initially denied all charges, but later confessed after days in chains. Hugues de Perraud and Jacques de Molay, both top-ranking officials, first denied everything, then relented under duress, then recanted again. That was the horror of it. Truth became a weapon. A man's silence could condemn him. A confession could save his life, but cost his soul. A retraction meant death at the stake. One Templar, unnamed in the records, was tortured so long that by the time he was brought to testify, he no longer remembered what he had confessed. What about the Church? Shouldn't the Pope have intervened? Clement V, born Raymond Bertrand de Got, was Pope in name, but France's hostage in truth. He owed his elevation to Philip IV, who had pressed him into the papacy with promises and veiled threats. When Philip demanded the Pope authorize the arrests, Clement protested, quietly. He tried to launch an investigation, but Philip had already seized the knights and confiscated their records. Clement's secret inquiry at Chinon revealed that many of the Templar confessions were coerced. In 2001, the Vatican finally released the Chinon parchment, proving that the Pope had privately absolved the Templar leadership. But by then it was too late. The machinery of propaganda had done its job. And Philip wasn't after papal approval. He was after destruction. The Templars were not tried, they were dismantled. Public burnings began. In 1310, 54 knights who retracted their confessions were burned alive in Paris. 2 years later, the Pope officially disbanded the order. And in 1314, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, was dragged to a pyre on an island in the Seine. Eyewitnesses say he refused to confess. He looked toward Notre Dame, cursed the king and the Pope, and stepped into the flames. What if the charges were lies, and everyone knew it? What if the Pope, the public, and even Philip's own advisors understood the truth, but looked away? Because once a lie grows large enough, when it's sewn into royal decrees, sung from pulpits and burned into flesh, the truth becomes too dangerous to touch. But the fire didn't end the story. Some say the Templars were gone. Others say they vanished, into banks, ships, and shadows. The real question was no longer were they guilty? The question was, what did they leave behind? In 1312 the axe fell with finality. Under immense pressure from Philip IV, Pope Clement V convened the Council of Vienne. This was not a trial, it was a stage play with every bishop and cardinal already seated in the role they were assigned. The Pope, cornered politically and physically, announced the formal dissolution of the Knights Templar. The justification? Not guilt, but scandal. Clement admitted the charges had not been fully proven but claimed the public outrage and rumors around the Templars were reason enough to dismantle them. No verdict. No appeal. Just extinction. The Pope's decree, Vox in Excelso, did not condemn the Knights. It simply declared that they must cease to exist for the greater good of the Church. The remaining Templars were either absorbed into other orders, like the Hospitallers, or quietly dispersed. Their lands were seized, their commanderies emptied, their symbols outlawed. What took 2 centuries to build was shattered in 2 years. But history, as it often does, refused to die with the documents. March 18, 1314. A gray sky blanketed the city of Paris. A small boat carried 2 men to a tiny island in the Seine, just beneath the gaze of Notre Dame Cathedral. One was Geoffroy de Charny, preceptor of Normandy. The other, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. They were supposed to confess again. They were promised mercy if they did. But this time in front of the crowd, Molay refused to repeat the lies. "I die in innocence," he is reported to have said. Then, with fire licking at the edges of the wood, he said something else. Chroniclers differ on the exact words. Some say he called on Philip IV and Clement V to stand before God's judgment within the year. Others, like Geoffrey of Paris and the Chronicle of Guillaume de Nantes, record that Molay swore both would soon die, and that all those responsible for the order's destruction would suffer. It sounds theatrical, apocalyptic, too clean. But here's what happened. Pope Clement V died 33 days later, of a violent illness, possibly colorectal cancer. Philip IV followed 6 months after, felled by a stroke after a hunting accident. And his sons, who each inherited the throne, died young and mysteriously, leading to the extinction of the Capetian male line within 14 years. And so the legend of the Templar curse was born. Not in prophecy, but in coincidence. And yet, for medieval minds, raised on signs, omens, and divine justice, it was no coincidence at all. It was retribution. Did Jacques de Molay truly curse the Pope and the King? We may never know what words passed through the flames. No scribe stood with pen in hand when the fire crackled over his final breath. But what is certain, and undeniable, is this. The men who killed the Templars fell. And the world took notice. In that moment, the line between myth and memory blurred. The Templars had been defeated. But their story had just begun. So if the order was dissolved, why do the symbols still linger in cathedrals, currencies, and conspiracy theories? What if they were never meant to vanish, only to go underground? The ashes cooled. The cross disappeared from their mantles. But the shadow of the Templars never left Europe. They burned their bodies, but not their secrets. And if they survived, where did they go? For most, the end of the Knights Templar came with a fire on the Seine. But history is rarely that clean. In the wake of the mass arrests and the dramatic death of Jacques de Molay, thousands of Templars simply vanished. Some were absorbed into other orders. Some renounced their vows. But others, according to whispers, parchments, and half-erased chronicles, never stopped serving the temple. What was lost wasn't just a military order. It was a secret network, a spiritual code, and perhaps a plan. In France, the Templars were hunted relentlessly. Their lands seized. Their names smeared with heresy. But outside of Philip IV's reach, the order's fate was different. In England, many Templars were arrested but later released, considered more misguided than malevolent. King Edward II, although pressured by the Pope, resisted turning over his Templar assets to the Hospitallers for years. Some former knights faded quietly into local monasteries. Others were simply unaccounted for. In Germany and Central Europe, the crackdown was slower, patchier. In some cases, regional bishops sheltered them, uncomfortable with the way Rome had handled the trials. In the Czech lands, Templar symbols continued to appear on local documents years after the supposed dissolution. This wasn't just political inertia. It hinted at pockets of loyalty that refused to die. The clearest trace of Templar survival comes from Portugal. There, King Dinis I refused to accept that the Templars were guilty of anything. He stalled enforcement of the papal bull and quietly created a new order in 1319. The Order of Christ. This wasn't a cover-up. It was a resurrection. Many former Portuguese Templars were inducted directly into the Order of Christ. Their property? Reassigned to the new organization. Their mission? Slightly rebranded, less crusade, more defense of the realm, but fundamentally unchanged. And in time, the Order of Christ would play a crucial role in the age of exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator, a Grand Master of the Order, would fly their cross on sails that reached the farthest coasts of the known world. So while the temple burned in Paris, its flame was relit in Lisbon. Then there are the rumors. Persistent, maddening, impossible to ignore. In Scotland, Legend holds that a group of Templars escaped France after the 1307 arrests and found refuge with Robert the Bruce, who had been excommunicated and thus had no loyalty to the Pope. The tale centers on the Battle of Bannockburn, 1314, a pivotal moment in the Scottish Wars of Independence. Some later accounts claim that a group of mysterious, heavily armed horsemen turned the tide of the battle. Their shields bore no crest. Their tactics were strange. Were they Templars? The evidence is thin. But the Rosslyn Chapel, built centuries later by the Sinclair family, descendants of Scottish nobility, contains carvings that some interpret as Templar symbols, and even depictions of maize, a new world crop. Coincidence? Or a whisper from the past? Switzerland, too, has become tangled in the web of Templar mythology. Some theorists point to the timing of the Swiss Confederation's emergence, just after the suppression of the Templars. The Swiss, like the Templars, were militarily disciplined, deeply secretive, and fiercely independent. Their rise to banking prominence, within decades, adds fuel to speculative fires. No documents link the Templars to the birth of Swiss identity. But Swiss banking inherited the same traits that once defined Templar treasuries: silence, security, and international trust. And in an age where secrets were power, few institutions were more feared or admired than those that kept them. The most tantalizing myth of all is the suggestion that the Templars may have sailed west, beyond the reach of Pope or King. A few fringe historians and esoteric writers point to carvings at Rosslyn, voyages of the Sinclairs, and Templar maps allegedly showing landmasses before Columbus. There is no definitive proof that the Templars reached the Americas. But the idea persists because of one uncomfortable truth. We don't know what happened to the Templar fleet. The records of the time mention Templar ships docked at La Rochelle. But when royal agents came looking in 1307, the harbor was empty. What happened to the Templar fleet? Did they scatter? Or did they carry something too valuable to lose, to a place no one could follow? The mystery remains. And as long as it does, so will the legends. Templar crosses can still be found on church walls. Their symbols are etched into medieval cathedrals, cryptic graffiti on forgotten pillars, or woven into family crests. In fiction they are villains. In conspiracy they are gods. But in history they were men. Flawed, determined, unrelenting. And what they built, a network of loyalty, secrecy, and power across continents, has never been replicated. If they survived, where did they go? Perhaps we're asking the wrong question. Maybe they never truly left. The ashes cooled. The cross disappeared from their mantles. But the shadow of the Templars never left Europe. They burned their bodies, but not their secrets. And if they survived, where did they go? For most, the end of the Knights Templar came with a fire on the Seine. But history is rarely that clean. In the wake of the mass arrests and the dramatic death of Jacques de Molay, thousands of Templars simply vanished. Some were absorbed into other orders. Some renounced their vows. But others, according to whispers, parchments, and half-erased chronicles, never stopped serving the temple. What was lost wasn't just a military order. It was a secret network, a spiritual code, and perhaps a plan. In France, the Templars were hunted relentlessly. Their lands seized. Their names smeared with heresy. But outside of Philip IV's reach, the order's fate was different. In England, many Templars were arrested but later released, considered more misguided than malevolent. King Edward II, although pressured by the Pope, resisted turning over his Templar assets to the Hospitallers for years. Some former knights faded quietly into local monasteries. Others were simply unaccounted for. In Germany and Central Europe, the crackdown was slower, patchier. In some cases, regional bishops sheltered them, uncomfortable with the way Rome had handled the trials. In the Czech lands, Templar symbols continued to appear on local documents years after the supposed dissolution. This wasn't just political inertia. It hinted at pockets of loyalty that refused to die. The clearest trace of Templar survival comes from Portugal. There, King Dinis I refused to accept that the Templars were guilty of anything. He stalled enforcement of the papal bull and quietly created a new order in 1319. The Order of Christ. This wasn't a cover-up. It was a resurrection. Many former Portuguese Templars were inducted directly into the Order of Christ. Their property? Reassigned to the new organization. Their mission? Slightly rebranded, less crusade, more defense of the realm, but fundamentally unchanged. And in time, the Order of Christ would play a crucial role in the Age of Exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator, a Grand Master of the Order, would fly their cross on sails that reached the farthest coasts of the known world. So while the temple burned in Paris, its flame was relit in Lisbon. Then there are the rumors. Persistent. Maddening. Impossible to ignore. In Scotland, legend holds that a group of Templars escaped France after the 1307 arrests and found refuge with Robert the Bruce, who had been excommunicated and thus had no loyalty to the Pope. The tale centers on the Battle of Bannockburn, 1314, a pivotal moment in the Scottish Wars of Independence. Some later accounts claim that a group of mysterious, heavily armed horsemen turned the tide of the battle. Their shields bore no crest. Their tactics were strange. Were they Templars? The evidence is thin. But the Rosslyn Chapel, built centuries later by the Sinclair family, descendants of Scottish nobility, contains carvings that some interpret as Templar symbols, and even depictions of maize, a new world crop. Coincidence? Or a whisper from the past? Switzerland, too, has become tangled in the web of Templar mythology. Some theorists point to the timing of the Swiss Confederation's emergence, just after the suppression of the Templars. The Swiss, like the Templars, were militarily disciplined, deeply secretive, and fiercely independent. Their rise to banking prominence, within decades, adds fuel to speculative fires. No documents link the Templars to the birth of Swiss identity. But Swiss banking inherited the same traits that once defined Templar treasuries: silence, security, and international trust. And in an age where secrets were power, few institutions were more feared, or admired, than those that kept them. The most tantalizing myth of all is the suggestion that the Templars may have sailed west, beyond the reach of pope or king. A few fringe historians and esoteric writers point to carvings at Rosslyn, voyages of the Sinclairs, and Templar maps allegedly showing landmasses before Columbus. There is no definitive proof that the Templars reached the Americas. But the idea persists because of one uncomfortable truth. We don't know what happened to the Templar fleet. The records of the time mention Templar ships docked at La Rochelle. But when royal agents came looking in 1307, the harbor was empty. What happened to the Templar fleet? Did they scatter? Or did they carry something too valuable to lose, to a place no one could follow? The mystery remains. And as long as it does, so will the legends. Templar crosses can still be found on church walls. Their symbols are etched into medieval cathedrals, cryptic graffiti on forgotten pillars, or woven into family crests. In fiction they are villains. In conspiracy they are gods. But in history they were men. Flawed, determined, unrelenting. And what they built, a network of loyalty, secrecy, and power across continents, has never been replicated. If they survived, where did they go? Perhaps we're asking the wrong question. Maybe they never truly left. They were erased by fire. But not even flames could silence the story. So we ask, why does the world still whisper their name? They burned the Grand Master to ash. They dismantled the order by decree. But the story? That only made it stronger. This is not the tale of what the Templars did. It's the tale of what we've made of them. The real order of the Knights Templar lasted just under 2 centuries. But in modern culture, they've lasted longer than empires. From Assassin's Creed to Indiana Jones, from the Da Vinci Code to National Treasure, the Templars are cast not as medieval warriors, but as keepers of eternal secrets. In fiction, they don't just protect pilgrims, they guard the truth itself. Why? Because the structure of their real history is too tempting to ignore. A wealthy, transnational brotherhood sworn to silence, suddenly erased, accused of heresy and burned at the stake. It reads less like dry medieval history and more like the origin story of a secret society. Their real rituals, midnight oaths, vows of poverty, silence at meals, all provide the perfect raw material for suspense and legend. By the 20th century, the Knights Templar had become the go-to stand-in for every global conspiracy. Bankers behind the curtain. Sword-bearers of forbidden gospels. Architects of hidden knowledge. What they actually were, disciplined, celibate knights with a rigorous code and bloody battlefield history, was buried beneath centuries of creative reinvention. And yet, those reinventions keep them alive. Because what we fear, what we long for, and what we don't understand, we turn into stories. And few stories are more persistent than theirs. The myth of the Holy Grail, the cup said to have caught Christ's blood at the crucifixion, did not begin with the Templars. But they became its most famous custodians. The earliest Grail romances, like Chrétien de Troyes Perceval, written in the late 12th century, describe mysterious knights on spiritual quests for a sacred object. Though the text never directly names the Templars, the imagery is hauntingly close. Cloistered warriors, sacred relics, and secrecy. Later writers, especially during the 13th and 14th centuries, began fusing the Grail myth with Templar identity, turning the Grail from a spiritual metaphor into a physical relic the knights had hidden. By the time of the Renaissance, the Templars were no longer just fighters for Christ. They were keepers of divine knowledge, tasked with guarding the bloodline of Jesus or the Ark of the Covenant, depending on the version. Even in modern interpretations, from Monty Python to the Last Crusade, Templars are cast as immortal watchmen, guarding secrets the world isn't ready for. And here's the thing, they never denied it. Because once the Templars were dissolved, the silence was deafening. And into that silence the Grail was placed, not by the church but by storytellers. It's not what they found beneath Solomon's temple that fueled the legend. It's what they might have found and never told. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code may have repopularized the Templars for a new generation, but he didn't create their mystique. He tapped into a literary and folkloric river that had been flowing for centuries. Long before the Da Vinci Code hit shelves, the 1982 book Holy Blood, Holy Grail had proposed the radical theory that the Templars were not just guardians of relics, but of Christ's bloodline, secretly preserved in France. That idea was based on earlier legends, like the one surrounding Rennes-le-Château and the Merovingian kings, a blend of archaeology, pseudo-history, and ecclesiastical gossip. But even before Holy Blood, Holy Grail, there were Freemason writings, Rosicrucian treatises, and 19th-century occult movements that insisted the Templars had survived, not just as an idea but in hiding. In the 1700s, Masonic degrees named after the Templars promised initiates access to ancient wisdom, lost knowledge of the Temple of Solomon, and eternal truths. Brown simply packaged it for the digital age, embedding centuries-old theories into fast-paced fiction. But the myth? The whispers. The suspicion that history has buried something it didn't want us to know? That was already alive. And that's why the Templars endure. Not because of swords, not because of treasure, but because in every generation we project our secrets onto them. So what is it we're really chasing when we chase the Templars? Is it gold? Or is it the part of history we were never meant to find? The real question isn't who the Templars were, it's why we keep bringing them back. The story of the Knights Templar is often told in extremes: fanatical warriors or enlightened mystics, loyal servants or dangerous heretics. But at its core, it is a mirror reflecting the deeper mechanics of power, loyalty, and control in the medieval world. At their height, the Templars were both insiders and outsiders, sworn to a church that gave them autonomy from kings, yet so entwined in royal finances that monarchs came begging for loans. They were both the sword of God and the ledger keepers of Christendom. This duality made them indispensable and dangerous. To a king like Philip IV, they weren't just a rival in wealth, but in trust. The Templars had their own network of information, messengers, ports, castles, and allegiance. A global force not bound to any single throne. That was fine when they were protecting Jerusalem. But when Jerusalem was lost, their independence looked more like insubordination. Their fall wasn't just a story of betrayal. It was a lesson in what happens when institutional loyalty crosses wires with shifting power. The Templars didn't betray the church or the kings. They outgrew them. And for that they were erased. In the medieval world, no institution, not even one cloaked in faith and blood, could exist beyond the reach of crown and altar. The sword that once protected pilgrims became too sharp to allow out of the sheath. Their execution wasn't just political. It was psychological. It was a message: no one is above the throne, not even God's knights. Centuries later, the Templars still live, not in flesh but in story. Why? Because every generation finds in them something missing in themselves. In the Enlightenment, they became symbols of suppressed knowledge. In nationalist movements, they were reclaimed as ancestral warriors. In modern media, they are puzzle pieces in conspiracies, cryptograms, and bloodlines. We remake the Templars because their history is just incomplete enough to fill with longing. They were men who took vows and built empires, who vanished into ash and left no final manuscript. The church wiped their records, the kings buried their names, and they themselves, sworn to secrecy, left us no confessions. That silence has become a canvas. In Portugal, they were reborn as the Order of Christ and quietly navigated ships into the age of exploration. In Scotland, myths tell of them joining Masonic lodges or sheltering beneath Rosslyn Chapel. In literature, they reappear as keepers of relics or martyrs of truth. In every story, they are transformed: warriors when we crave strength, guardians when we fear lies, heretics when we seek rebellion. The real men who fought and died under the Red Cross might not recognize these versions. But perhaps they would understand the need for them. For even in death, their silence speaks, and we keep answering back. We began with flames, a man tied to a stake, silent, proud, watching the fire rise. We end in silence too, not because the story is over, but because the echoes are still traveling. The Knights Templar were never just soldiers. They were part of something larger. A world trying to define what it meant to believe, to obey, to fight, and to surrender. Their code was born from faith. But faith, when stretched across politics, gold, war, and betrayal, changes shape. It becomes something else. A banner. A whisper. A warning. What remains when the rituals are gone? When the relics are lost, when the armor is dust? The story. Not the truth, perhaps, but the need for the truth. The Templars remind us that history is not just what happened. It's what we remember and what we're willing to believe. Their bones lie in unmarked graves. Their rulebooks gather dust in archives. But still we look for them, in vaults, in maps, in cathedrals, in ourselves. And maybe that's the real legacy of the Knights Templar. Not what they held in their hands, but what they left in our minds. A shadow that stretches 700 years long, asking us not to forget what power once dared to hide. If this story moved you, If you felt the weight of history in these hours, then don't let it fade. Subscribe now and help us keep these stories alive. For those of you still watching but staying silent, we want to know, why haven't you subscribed yet? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Be honest, be bold, because in this place even the whispers are heard.